The dust of Kepler 186f never truly left Dr. Eris Thorne. He felt it in the dry catch of his throat on sleepless nights, saw it in the rust-colored motes dancing in the sunbeams of his quiet study, and tasted its metallic tang in the cheap synth coffee that had become his only reliable companion. It was the dust of failure, the sediment of 6 corpses and a career buried under the weight of a single, catastrophic miscalculation. 10 years ago, he had stood on that world and preached a gospel of understanding to a species that communicated only in violence, and in return, they had torn his expedition apart, limb by bloody limb. The official report, penned by the same military command that had reluctantly provided his security detail, was a masterpiece of condemnation. It painted him as a naive academic, a man whose misguided faith in communication had led brave soldiers to their deaths. He became the hegemony's cautionary tale, the ghost story they told cadets to justify the doctrine that had risen from his ashes. Humanity's manifest destiny was to speak from the barrel of a railgun, and the only good Xeno was a silent one. He'd been exiled not to a prison, but to something far crueler for a man of his intellect irrelevance. He taught introductory anthropology at a provincial university on Earth, his lectures filled with hollow-eyed students who cared more about their social feeds than the nuanced tapestry of sentient life he tried so desperately to unveil. They didn't know his name was once a curse in the halls of Aegis Command, that he was the man who had tried to talk and failed. He was just a relic, another professor droning on about things that didn't matter in a galaxy so thoroughly, brutally pacified by human might. The peace, however, was a fragile thing, built on the arrogant assumption that the universe had shown humanity its most dangerous hand and lost. The first sign that this assumption was wrong came not with a bang, but with a whisper of silence from Janusthur, a desolate moon orbiting a gas giant at the fringe of explored space, a small research outpost, just a dozen scientists studying gravitational anomalies, simply ceased transmitting. Silence was not unusual. Cometary interference or solar flares could disrupt communications for days. But after a week, Aegis Command dispatched the Corvette stalwart to investigate. The stalwart's report was chilling in its sterility. The Janus 4 outpost was pristine, untouched by conflict or catastrophe. The airlocks were sealed. Life support was nominal, and a half-finished game of zero-G chess floated in the recreation module. The only thing missing was the crew. All 12 scientists had vanished without a trace. In their place were crystalline growths, jagged, quartz-like structures that sprouted from consoles, floors, and even the personal effects left on the bunks. They hummed with a low, resonant frequency that made the teeth of the investigating Marines ache. When a Marine, following protocol, attempted to take a sample with a laser scalpel, the crystal he touched did not break. It shattered into 1,000,000 points of light. In that same instant, the Marine, a 24-year-old man in the prime of his life, collapsed. His comrades watched in horror through their helmet cams as his body withered inside his armored suit, flesh turning to leather, bone to powder. In less than 3 seconds, a man became a pile of ancient dust. The only other clue was a corrupted audio log from the station's chief physicist, a frantic, looping fragment recovered from a damaged server. The voice was strained, breathless with a terror that transcended words. It's not attacking. It's not hostile. It's listening. It's learning our past. God, it's inside our memories. The recording was dismissed by Aegis Command as the ramblings of a mind succumbing to an unknown environmental toxin. The official designation for the new threat was Crystalline Entity X, or CEEX. Admiral Valerius, the celebrated architect of the hegemony's aggressive expansion, saw the Janus IV incident as a test of his doctrine: charismatic, ruthless, and utterly certain of humanity's superiority. Valerius was the very embodiment of the military machine that had cast Eris out. It was Valerius who had personally ordered the sanitization of Kepler-186f a decade ago, turning the planet and its violent inhabitants into radioactive glass and, in the process, cementing his own legend while bearing Eris's shame. He dispatched a full battle group to the Janus system with a single, simple order: sterilize the moon. The orbital bombardment was overwhelming, a symphony of destruction that scoured the surface of Janus until it glowed like a miniature sun. Victory was declared. A new medal was minted, but the silence didn't stop. A few weeks later, a deep space communications relay near Mars, a vital node in the Sol system's network, went dark. A repair crew found it perfectly intact, its systems cold, and its metallic surfaces infested with the same humming crystals. Then a freighter on the Titan trade route vanished, only to be found drifting and silent. Its crew gone, its cargo bay a garden of crystalline structures. The entity wasn't on Janus Arf. It was Janus Arfar, and the bombardment had been like trying to kill a plague by burning a single corpse. It had spread, using the very technology that connected humanity: the hyper-relays, the comm signals, the ship corridors as its arteries. Valerius's hammer, so effective against flesh and steel, was useless against a ghost. On the Aegis flagship Invictus, a vessel that was more a flying city of war than a mere ship, the top minds of the hegemony were stumped. The entity had no discernible biology, no energy signature they could track, no conventional footprint in the universe. It was a phantom, a disease of physics. In the lowest levels of the ship's intelligence division, a young analyst named Jin, haunted by the dead physicist's last words, ran a deep archive search for non-standard xeno-contact theories. He cross-referenced memory, non-corporeal, and acoustical resonance. The search returned a single, heavily redacted file: Thorn, Eris, Doctor. His theories, once laughed out of every serious scientific circle, spoke of consciousness existing as pure pattern, of life without biology, of intelligence coded into the very fabric of space-time. They were the ravings of a broken man, but they were the only words in the entirety of the hegemony's vast database that seemed to describe the impossible enemy they now faced. The summons felt like a ghost's touch. A sterile black transport, bearing the stark white sigil of the Aegis, landed on the university's quad, its engines scorching the manicured lawns. Aris was escorted by two Marines whose faces were hidden behind reflective visors, their silence a heavier judgment than any words. The journey to the Invictus was a silent ascent from his purgatory back into the heart of the heaven he had been cast out of. The flagship was a monument to power, its corridors gleaming with a confidence that felt like an accusation. He was a specter at the feast, a hunched figure in worn academic tweeds shuffling through a world of crisp uniforms and rigid salutes. He was led to an observation deck that overlooked the swirling vortex of hyperspace, a cold, starless blue. There, he was met by Captain Eva Rostova, Valerius's second-in-command. She was a woman carved from ice and iron, her gaze sharp enough to strip a man of his convictions. She was a true believer, a disciple of the Valerian doctrine, and her distaste for Eris was a palpable force in the room. "Dr. Thorne," she said, her voice devoid of warmth, "your file is extensive." She gestured to a holographic display that shimmered into existence between them. It showed the Janus IV outpost, serene and dead. It showed the Marine withering into dust. It played the dead physicist's final, terrified words. "We have exhausted conventional analysis. Your name was suggested as a theoretical consultant." The term hung in the air, thick with condescension. Eris stared at the images. The dust of Kepler 186f, a sudden, bitter taste in his mouth. He felt the old, familiar weight of failure, but this time it was mingled with a new, chilling dread. This was not the mindless, snarling rage of the creatures that had killed his team. This was something else entirely, something methodical, silent, and utterly alien. The humming of the crystals, the disappearance of the crew, the way the Marine didn't just die, but was unwritten from time itself. He looked past Rostova, at the cold, churning hyperspace beyond the viewport, and, for the first time in 10 years, the disgraced academic felt the thrill of pure, terrifying understanding. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, what they were facing. He turned back to the captain, his voice a dry rasp, the voice of a man who had stared into an abyss and was now being asked to describe it. "You're calling them an entity," he began, his gaze locking with hers. "You're wrong. You're looking for a creature, a ship, a weapon. You think you can fight it. You can't." Rostova's expression hardened, her patience already wearing thin. "Then what is it?" Dr. Eris took a slow breath, the words forming a dreadful shape in his mind. "It isn't a life form. It's a phenomenon, a form of consumption, but it doesn't feed on matter or energy. It feeds on information. Specifically, it feeds on the past." He pointed a trembling finger at the looping footage of the dying Marine. That man wasn't killed. He was erased. His lifespan, his history. From birth to that moment, it was consumed. Like fuel. These things, these echoes, they don't just listen to memories. They eat them. They are entropy given a hunger, and they have just discovered the richest, most complex source of fuel in the known universe. He swept his arm out, gesturing to the ship around them, to the galaxy beyond. Us, our history, our art, our wars, our love, our pain. Every memory in every human mind is a feast. They aren't invading us. Captain, they are harvesting us. Captain Rostova stared at him, her face a mask of rigid disbelief. In her eyes, he saw not the dawn of understanding, but the cold, hard certainty that she was standing in a room with a madman. The ghost they had summoned was not a savior. It was just as broken as his file suggested, and outside, in the silent darkness between worlds, the harvest had already begun. The condescension in Captain Rostova's quarters was as cold and sterile as the polished bulkhead. Aris was given a small, windowless room, more a cell than a guest suite, where he was expected to wait while the ship's preeminent minds picked apart his hypothesis. He knew what they would find. His theory lived in the space between disciplines, a chimera of quantum physics, anthropology, and theoretical metaphysics. To a military science council, it would sound like poetry, not science and in their world. Poetry was a synonym for nonsense. He was a curiosity, a relic to be examined and then quietly put back in his box. His only contact with the outside was the silent guard at his door and the bland nutrient paste delivered thrice daily. It was on the third day, as he was tracing the crystalline patterns from the Janus Fur data onto a spare datapad, that a soft chime, barely audible, emanated from the room's waste reclamation unit. Puzzled, Eris knelt and found a microcom unit, no bigger than his thumbnail, taped just inside the chute. He activated it, and a hushed voice, young and nervous, filled his ear. "Dr. Thorne, this is Analyst Jin. I was the one who pulled your file." Eris recognized the name from the redacted summons. "Analyst," Eris whispered back, his heart quickening. "This is an unwise channel. Sir, they're not listening. The Science Council already filed their report. They've classified CEX as a self-replicating silicon-based bioweapon employing mimetic warfare. They think it's a weapon. Sir, something made by an unknown race." Eris felt a cold laugh die in his throat. Of course they did. They couldn't conceive of a universe that wasn't shaped by intention, by a will to conquer. They're wrong. Jin, it's not a weapon. It's a predator. A weapon has a purpose, a wielder. A predator simply is. It hunts. It feeds. It exists. You can't negotiate with a hurricane. "I believe you," Jin said, his voice gaining a sliver of confidence. "The energy readings don't make sense for a weapon. There's no waste heat, no radiation, just a temporary quantum decoherence. It's like the laws of thermodynamics are being politely ignored." Over the next few days, Jin became his lifeline. The young analyst was a prodigy, a digital native who could navigate the ship's labyrinthine networks like a ghost in the machine. He fed Aris a constant stream of raw data, bypassing the filters and summaries of the official channels. Together, in hushed whispers and encrypted data bursts, they refined the horrifying theory. Aris posited that the crystals were the fossilized remnants of the process. The echoes, as he now called them, were not the crystals themselves, but a quantum state phenomenon. They resonated with the complex electrochemical patterns of a sentient mind, the physical architecture of memory. The richer and more complex the life, the more memories, experiences, and emotional weight, the stronger the resonance. The echoes would lock on to a consciousness, consume the entirety of its informational pattern in a single, silent instant, and the collapse of that quantum information would leave behind the crystal as a kind of byproduct, a tombstone made of pure data. The victim's physical form, its pattern no longer sustained, would simply cease to be coherent matter. "They're not just eating memories," Eris explained to Jin one night, his voice heavy with the weight of the revelation. "They're consuming a soul, for lack of a better word. They're taking the sum total of a person's existence. Their clandestine work was cut short by a new system-wide alert. Helios Station, an orbital habitat in the Alpha Centauri system with a civilian population of over 50,000, had gone silent. The pattern was identical, a sudden cessation of all communication, followed by an unnerving, perfect quiet. This was no remote outpost. This was a city in the sky, a beacon of hegemony expansion. The news sent a shockwave through the Invictus. Admiral Valerius appeared on the ship-wide comms, his face a granite mask of resolve. He would not allow a civilian population to be held hostage by an unseen enemy. He announced the immediate deployment of the 7th Fleet's Elite Marine Division, the legendary Void Ghosts, to retake the station. It was a declaration of war against a shadow. Eris felt a surge of panic. Jin, you have to get a message to Rostova, to anyone who will listen. They can't send in the Void Ghosts. Why? Sir, they're the best. They've fought in every major conflict for the last 30 years. That's exactly why they can't go. Eris hissed into the comm. 30 years of conflict means 30 years of memories, of trauma, of brotherhood, of victory. They're not soldiers. Jin, they're a 5-course meal. The echoes will be drawn to them like sharks to blood. Jin did as he was asked, routing an anonymous, high-priority message directly to Captain Rostova's personal console. The message was succinct. CEX targets experiential complexity. The more a soldier has lived, the more vulnerable they are. Sending in veterans is a death sentence. Use unmanned drones. Do not send your best men. The message was received, read, and ignored. To Rostova and Valerius, it was an act of cowardice, more proof of the disgraced doctor's broken psyche. Drones were for scouting, not for righteous battle. The Void Ghosts were a symbol of hegemony strength. To hide them away would be an admission of fear. The assault on Helios Station was broadcast on a secure command channel. A live feed piped directly to the Invictus's bridge. Rostova stood beside Valerius, her posture rigid, her confidence absolute. Aris, confined to his room, could only watch through the illicit feed Jin had patched for him. The initial insertion was flawless. Squads of Marines in obsidian black power armor moved through the silent, pristine corridors of the station. The only sign of trouble was the now familiar crystalline growths, which seemed to cover every surface, glowing with a soft, internal luminescence. The station was a cathedral of alien art and human absence. The first contact was anticlimactic. A Marine in Delta Squad rounded a corner and saw a shimmering in the air, a heat haze distortion where there was no heat. Contact, he stated calmly, raising his plasma rifle. Indeterminate energy field. He fired. The bolt of superheated gas hit the shimmer and, instead of exploding, was simply absorbed. The air warped, and for a half-second, the humming of the crystals intensified across the entire station. Then the true horror began. It started not with a scream, but with a confused murmur over the comms from the Marine who had fired. "Wait, I see. Mom, is that you?" His helmet cam, linked to the squad's feed, flickered. Instead of the corridor, it showed a grainy, sun-drenched image of a small house with a white picket fence. The Marine took a stumbling step forward, his rifle lowering. "I'm coming home!" His commanding officer shouted his name, but it was too late. The shimmering enveloped him. The other Marines in his squad watched, frozen, as the man's armor began to glow. His voice came over the comms, but it was a chorus of 100 voices at once. His first words, his wedding vows, his battle cries, all spoken in a single, terrible instant. Then, silence. The armor clattered to the floor, empty. A new, intricate crystal, larger than the others, bloomed on the spot where he had stood. Panic erupted. It was a contagion of memory. Another Marine screamed as his helmet display filled with the face of an enemy he'd killed years ago. A third babbled incoherently about a lost dog from his childhood. The echoes were inside their heads, using their own pasts as weapons, turning their richest memories into resonant frequencies that tore them apart from the inside out. The Void Ghosts, the most battle-hardened and psychologically resilient soldiers in the fleet, were the most susceptible. Their minds were libraries of experience, and the echoes were burning the books page by page. On the bridge of the Invictus, the tactical display was a cascade of failure. Biomonitor signals flatlined one after another. Helmet cams showed nothing but static, or worse, fleeting, impossible images of birthday parties and beach vacations. Admiral Valerius stared, his knuckles white on the command console, his mind unable to process a battle where the enemy was the concept of history itself. He saw only a rout, a failure of discipline, not a fundamental misunderstanding of the universe. "What is this?" he roared, his voice shaking with fury. "Psychic warfare. A mimetic agent. Get me a counter-frequency." Rostova said nothing. She was watching a feed from the last surviving member of Alpha Squad, a grizzled sergeant who had barricaded himself in a medical bay. He wasn't screaming. He was sitting on the floor, weeping, whispering the name of a daughter he had lost to plague a decade earlier. The shimmering distortion was seeping through the sealed door. "It's okay, Sarah," he whispered to the empty air. "Daddy's here." The feed went dark. Rostova turned away from the screen, her face pale, the rigid certainty shattered. She had just watched the soul of her fleet be systematically devoured. The doctrine of overwhelming force had not just failed, it had been an accelerant, a seasoning for the slaughter. Late that night, long after Valerius had secluded himself in his chambers to rage at a universe that refused to bend to his will, Captain Rostova came to Eris's room. She dismissed the guard with a curt nod and entered, sealing the door behind her. The mask of command was gone, replaced by a haunted, raw vulnerability. She looked at the man she had dismissed as a coward and a fool, and for the first time, she saw him not as a failure, but as a prophet. "You were right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We sent them to their deaths. We fed them to it." Eris looked up from his datapad. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a profound, weary sadness. "You sent experienced men to fight an enemy that eats experience. It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline." "Then how?" she asked. The question of plea. How do we fight it? What weapon can we possibly use against something that isn't even there? Aris leaned back, the silence in the small room stretching for a long moment. He looked at this captain, this perfect soldier, and saw the terror in her eyes, the fear of a life lived, of a past that had suddenly become a liability. "You don't need better soldiers," he said, his voice quiet and heavy, with a terrible, new idea. "You don't need veterans or heroes. To fight an enemy that feeds on the past, you need a weapon with no history. You need a human being who has never truly lived." He paused, letting the impossible concept settle in the cold air between them. "You need a blank slate, a ghost." The silence that followed Aris's proposal was heavier than the ship's artificial gravity. Captain Rostova did not flinch, did not recoil in horror. Instead, a strange, calculating light entered her eyes. The idea, monstrous as it was, had the brutal logic of a weapon she could finally understand. A null value, a zero. It was the only variable that made sense in an equation of impossible terror. A weapon with no history, he repeated, the words tasting like ash. Where would we find such a thing? She already knew the answer. The hegemony, in its relentless pursuit of dominance, had archives of projects so dark they were officially listed as non-existent. She left Eris in his room, the unspoken promise of a new, more terrible collaboration hanging in the air. Her report to Admiral Valerius was a masterclass in military brevity. She omitted Eris's name, framing the blank slate concept as a theoretical countermeasure developed by her own intelligence annex. Valerius, smarting from the public humiliation of the Void Ghost's annihilation, was desperate for a weapon, any weapon. That wasn't another fleet to throw into the meat grinder. He didn't care about the ethics. He cared about the optics of victory. He authorized a search of the hegemony's deepest black sites. The answer came back from a research station hidden in the heart of a nebula, a place called Tartarus. It was officially a long-range stellar observatory. In reality, it was the home of the Chrysalis program, an abandoned super-soldier project from the early days of the hegemony. The goal had been to create the perfect infiltrator, a genetically engineered human clone, grown in total sensory deprivation, with a mind left completely unformed. The idea was to flash imprint a personality and skill set onto this empty vessel for a specific mission, then wipe it clean for the next. The program was a failure. The unformed mind proved too fragile to handle the imprinting process. The subjects either went catatonic or suffered catastrophic psychotic breaks. But the project had not been entirely dismantled. One subject, designated Eve, had been kept in stasis for over 20 years, a living, breathing, but unwritten book, maintained by automated systems as a biological curiosity. Eris was escorted to Tartarus by Rostova herself. The station was a tomb, its corridors cold and silent, powered only by a skeleton crew of silent, gray-uniformed technicians who seemed more like ghosts than people. They were led to a central chamber dominated by a single, coffin-like pod made of opaque, milky polymer. Inside, suspended in nutrient-rich amniotic fluid, was a woman. Her features were serene, her body adult but unmarked by a single day of life. Wires and tubes snaked from her skin, monitoring a brain that had never formed a thought, a heart that had never felt a pang of joy or sorrow. "Is she aware?" Eris asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. He felt a profound sense of violation, of trespass against the very concept of a soul. "No," said the station's chief technician, a man with the pallor of a cave fish. "Her brain activity is a flat line of pure potential. No dreams, no memories, no self. She is, for all intents and purposes, not yet born. The process of birthing her was a sterile, mechanical affair. The fluid was drained, the pod hissed open, and the cold air of the chamber touched her skin for the first time. Her eyes, a pale, depthless gray, snapped open. There was no confusion in them, no fear, only a blank animal curiosity. She took a breath, not with the panicked gasp of a newborn, but with a slow, mechanical intake. As the technicians unhooked her and helped her to her feet, she moved with an unnerving grace. Her muscles, developed through 2 decades of passive electrical stimulation, responding perfectly. She was a body, an organism, but the person was absent. Eris felt a wave of nausea. This was his idea. This living atrocity was his creation. He had advocated for a weapon, and the hegemony had delivered him a human being they had denied the right to exist. Rostova, however, was all business. Her face was set, her gaze fixed on the subject. Can she follow instructions? She asked the technician. Simple ones. Her motor cortex can be stimulated. We can teach her to walk, to hold an object, to identify a target by its resonant frequency. But she will never understand why. There is no why in her. The training, if it could be called that, was surreal. They placed a small, contained crystal taken from the Helios station in a test chamber. It hummed with its low, malevolent frequency. Then they brought in Eve. She was dressed in a simple gray jumpsuit, her bare feet silent on the metal floor. She showed no reaction to the room, to the armed guards, to Aris and Rostova watching from behind reinforced glass. But when her gaze fell upon the crystal, something shifted. Her head tilted. A flicker of something, not emotion, but a kind of focused intent appeared in her blank eyes. She walked towards it, her steps fluid and certain. She was not drawn to it with fear or aggression, but with a kind of elemental opposition, like a vacuum being drawn to a pressure source. She reached out a hand and laid it on the crystal. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the crystal's internal light flickered and died. The humming ceased. Eve pulled her hand back, and the crystal crumbled into a fine, inert dust that scattered on the floor. She then turned and stood, waiting, her face once again a perfect, unreadable mask. The observers were silent. Eris felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's temperature. She hadn't destroyed it. She had canceled it. The echoes fed on complex information, on the patterns of a life lived. Eve was a walking, breathing paradox, a human with the informational value of a stone. To the echoes, she was a blind spot in the universe, a region of absolute zero. And when she touched their physical manifestation, her state of pure nullity simply unmade them. It works. Rostova breathed, a mixture of awe and horror in her voice. She's invisible to them. More than that, she's their antithesis. Back in the observation room, the moral chasm between Aris and Rostova became a battlefield. "What have we done?" Aris said, running a hand through his thinning hair. "We can't use her like this. She's not a tool. She needs to be taught, to be allowed to become human." "No," Rostova countered, her voice sharp as broken glass. "We can't. The moment we teach her language, give her a memory, show her affection, the moment she becomes a person, we turn her into a target. Her emptiness is her armor and her sword. To make her human is to disarm her." Eris stared at her, seeing the brutal, pragmatic calculus of a soldier. She was right. To save Eve, he would have to sacrifice humanity. To save humanity, he would have to sacrifice her. He had created a savior who could only save them by remaining a monster. Valerius, receiving Rostova's report, was ecstatic. He had his weapon, a silver bullet for the ghosts that haunted his fleet. He dismissed the ethical concerns as sentimental drivel. He ordered an immediate field test. The target was the science vessel Odyssey, a ship that had gone silent a month prior and was now drifting in a stable orbit. Its internal space is known to be heavily infested with crystalline growths. The plan was simple. A small stealth ship would drop Eve on board. She would cleanse the ship, and then be retrieved. The insertion was televised to the command staff on the Invictus. Eris watched, his stomach in knots. Eve was fitted with a simple biometric suit and a helmet camera, but she carried no weapon. She was the weapon. The feed showed her moving through the silent corridors of the Odyssey, a gray phantom in a crystal garden. The ship was beautiful in a terrifying way, every surface glittering with the intricate and deadly blossoms of the echoes. The low hum was a constant presence on the audio feed. She moved with an eerie purpose, never hesitating, never looking back. She wasn't clearing the ship room by room like a soldier. She was following a path only she could perceive, moving towards the areas of strongest resonance. The camera showed her entering the ship's arboretum. It was the epicenter of the infestation. The largest crystals grew here, some as tall as a person, sprouting from the desiccated remains of the crew. In the center of the room, a massive, cathedral-like crystal pulsed with a faint, rhythmic light, the fossilized echo of the ship's captain. Eve walked to the central crystal. She placed both her hands on its surface. For the first time, the camera registered a change in her. Her vitals, which had been as steady as a machine's, spiked. Her breathing hitched. A sound escaped her lips, not a word, but a low, guttural cry, a sound of pure, uncomprehending stimulus. The audio feed crackled. The humming from the crystals rose in pitch, becoming a piercing shriek. On the bridge of the Invictus, alarms blared as the sensors monitoring the Odyssey went haywire. "What's happening?" Valerius demanded. "Report it's an energy surge, Admiral," an officer called out. "But it's negative energy. It's a quantum sink. The ship's energy readings are plummeting into theoretical values." Through the helmet cam, Eris watched, his blood turning to ice. The light inside the great crystal was being pulled into Eve's hands. The crystal itself began to crack, not crumbling this time, but dissolving, turning into black smoke that was drawn into her palms. The shriek became a deafening roar of static. And in that static, for just a fraction of a second, Eris heard a voice, 1,000 voices crying out a single synthesized word: Thorn. The feed went dead. The energy readings from the Odyssey vanished. The ship was still there, a dead hulk in the darkness. But the hum was gone. The silence that came from it was no longer menacing. It was just empty. The weapon had worked. The ship was clean. But something had gone terribly wrong. The echoes had been silent hunters, predators without a voice. But in their final, agonizing moment of unmaking, they had learned a name. His name. He looked at the blank screen, and a new, more personal terror bloomed in his chest. He had wanted to understand the echoes. Now, it seemed, they were beginning to understand him. The retrieval team found Eve unconscious on the floor of the Odyssey's arboretum, surrounded by a fine layer of inert, gray dust. Back in the medbay on Tartarus, she was a medical enigma. Her vitals were stable, but her brain, once a placid sea of pure potential, was now a storm of chaotic neural activity. She was locked in a state that was not quite a coma, not quite consciousness. She didn't respond to stimuli, but a single, low-frequency electrical signal, unlike anything in human neurology, pulsed rhythmically from her temporal lobe. It was a faint, repeating echo of the crystal's hum. Iris sat by her bedside for days, a silent, guilt-ridden vigil. He had unleashed this, both the monster and the cure. He watched her still face, searching for a flicker of the person she had never been allowed to become. He saw nothing but a beautiful, empty vessel that had been filled with a terrifying, alien energy. She absorbed it, he told Rostova, who visited the station under the guise of overseeing the project's next phase. The informational payload of that entire ship, every memory, every life, it didn't just vanish. It went into her. She's not a blank slate anymore. She's a library, and the books are written in a language that is driving her mad. Rostova's pragmatism was unyielding. Can she still function as a weapon? I don't know what she is anymore. Aris confessed. But the echoes know my name. They spoke it. That's not the behavior of a mindless phenomenon. It's the behavior of something that is learning, adapting. We treated this like pest control, but we've just taught the pest how to think. His words were prophetic. The lull in the echo's expansion ended abruptly. They began to move with a new, terrifying intelligence. They no longer infested random ships or outposts. They started targeting hegemony assets with surgical precision naval shipyards, communication hubs, and, most chillingly, military academies. They were no longer just feeding. They were targeting humanity's ability to fight back, consuming not just the past, but the future. Admiral Valerius, refusing to see the pattern, doubled down on his doctrine of force. He assembled the largest fleet in human history, the Aegis Armada, a jaw-dropping display of power designed for a single, final solution, a system-by-system, planet-by-planet scorched earth campaign. He would burn out the infection by burning down the galaxy. The plan was madness. It was an act of galactic suicide. Aris knew that throwing more ships, more crews, more rich, complex memories at the echoes would be like pouring fuel on a wildfire. He had to find another way. He and Jin, now his indispensable secret ally, worked frantically. They studied the new signal emanating from Eve's brain, cross-referencing it with the corrupted data from the Janus Far outpost and the final, terrible transmission from the Odyssey. A chilling pattern emerged. The echoes had a structure, a kind of distributed consciousness. They weren't a swarm. They were a single entity existing in a million places at once. The crystals were their anchor points, their synapses. But a consciousness needs a focal point. Aris mused one sleepless night, staring at the swirling patterns on his screen. A central nexus, a mind. Where is the I in all of this? The answer lay in the first victim. Jin, digging through the deep archives, discovered that the chief physicist from Janus the Ver, a Dr. Alistair Finch, had been a pioneer in quantum consciousness theory. He had believed that the universe itself was a conscious entity and that a human mind could theoretically resonate with it. His last log entry, dismissed as a toxin-induced delusion, took on a horrifying new meaning. It's listening. It's inside our memories. He didn't just die. Jin, Eris whispered into the comm. He was the first. He was the most complex mind on that station. They didn't just consume him. He became their template. His mind was the seed crystal around which their entire consciousness formed. They're not just a phenomenon anymore. They are, in some fractured, monstrous way. Alistair Finch. That's how they learned my name. Finch knew my work. We corresponded years ago. His memory of me is now part of their mind. They had to find the source, the original crystal, the fossilized remnant of Finch's consciousness. Destroying the scattered infestations was useless. They had to kill the brain. Aris theorized it would still be on Janus of Irf, the point of origin, the epicenter of the entire nightmare. But the moon had been bombarded into a molten sphere of glass and radiation. Nothing could have survived. Nothing physical, Jin corrected, his voice buzzing with excitement. He sent Eris a complex astrometrics chart. The bombardment was kinetic and thermal, but the echoes exist in a quantum state. The explosion would have been like throwing a rock through a ghost. The physical moon is gone, but its quantum signature remains. A ghost moon. And according to these resonance scans, something is still there. Something is still humming at the heart of that dead system. Aris knew what he had to do. He had to go to Janus Yor, and he had to take Eve with him. She was the only weapon that could destroy a mind made of memory. Convincing Rostova was the greatest challenge of his life. He found her on the Invictus, overseeing the final preparations for Valerius's armada. The ship hummed with the energy of a coiled snake. Ready to strike, he laid out his theory, not as a plea, but as a cold, logical certainty. Admiral Valerius is about to sacrifice the entire fleet to feed the very monster he's trying to kill, Eris stated, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. Your doctrine has failed. Force is irrelevant. We have one chance, not to defeat them, but to silence them. Send me, Eve, and a small, fast ship to Janus Fur. Give me a 24-hour head start before the armada jumps. Rostova listened, her face an unreadable cipher. She was a soldier, loyal to the chain of command, loyal to the admiral who had built her career. But she had seen the void ghosts die. She had seen the raw, undeniable truth of Aris's initial warning. To follow Valerius now was an act of faith in a god who had been proven false. To follow Aris was an act of treason. Even if I believed you, she said, her voice low. The Admiral would never sanction this. It's a suicide mission based on the ramblings of a disgraced academic and a catatonic clone. Then don't tell him, Aris countered, his gaze unwavering. Give us a stealth ship, a malfunctioning transponder, a 24-hour comms blackout on your best long-range scout. Bury it in the paperwork. You are his most trusted captain. You can make a ship disappear. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the war between duty and reason. He pressed his final, most desperate point. You saw what happened to those soldiers. Eva. You watched them be unwritten. Valerius's plan will do that to billions. This is not about winning a war anymore. It's about saving the story of humanity from being erased. The use of her first name, an intimacy he had no right to claim, hung in the air. It was a gamble, a recognition of the person behind the uniform. For a long minute, she was silent. Then she turned to her console and, with a few swift, practiced keystrokes, began to type. The Scout Corvette Silent Arrow is scheduled for a deep-range sensor calibration run at 0400, she said, not looking at him. Its guidance system has been known to be unreliable. The flight plan takes it past the Janus system. I expect a full diagnostic report in 25 hours. Not 1 minute later, Thorn. She turned to face him, her eyes chips of ice. If you're wrong, your ghost will have the honor of being the first to be vaporized by the Armada's opening salvo. If you're right, you will have saved us all, and no one will ever know it. The journey to Janus therefore was an exercise in tension. Aris, Jin who had volunteered to pilot, claiming his skills were essential to the mission, but in truth was too terrified to be left behind, and a comatose Eve were the sole occupants of the Silent Arrow. As they neared the dead system, the ship's sensors began to pick up the ghost signal, the low, pervasive hum of the echoes, stronger than it had ever been recorded. It was a siren song of pure dread. Eve began to stir. Her fingers twitched. A low moan escaped her lips. The hum was calling to her, or to the part of the echoes she now carried within her. They dropped out of hyperspace into a scene of utter desolation. The planet Janus was a scarred, blackened orb. Its moon was gone, replaced by a shimmering, barely visible sphere of distorted space-time, a quantum wound in the fabric of reality. "That's it," Jin whispered, his face pale in the cockpit's glow. "The ghost of Janus Ur." Eris took a deep breath. "Take us in, slow." As the silent arrow pierced the event horizon of the ghost moon, the ship groaned. Reality warped. The stars outside the viewport smeared into streaks of impossible color. The hum was no longer a sound. It was a physical pressure, a vibration that resonated in their bones, in their teeth, in the ship's small medbay. Eve sat bolt upright. Her eyes snapped open, but the pale, depthless gray was gone. Her irises now swirled with a soft, internal luminescence, the same light that had glowed within the crystals. She stood, pulling the monitors from her skin with a calm, deliberate strength. Eris rushed to the medbay just as she stepped out, her movements no longer humanly graceful, but alienly precise. "Eve," he said, his voice trembling. She turned her head to look at him, but she didn't see him. Her glowing eyes were focused on something beyond him, beyond the ship, at the heart of the quantum storm outside. A voice came from her lips, but it was not her own. It was a chorus, a symphony of thousands of stolen lives, all speaking with the faint, academic cadence of Dr. Alistair Finch. "The archivist has arrived," it said. "It is time to close the book." The being that was once Eve raised a hand, and the bulkhead in front of her dissolved into a cloud of black dust, opening a direct path to the swirling chaos of the ghost moon. She was no longer a weapon against the echoes. She had become their avatar. The space where the bulkhead had been was not a void, but a tunnel of churning, silent chaos. Through it, Eris could see the heart of the ghost moon, a maelstrom of light and shadow, a storm of pure information. The being that wore Eve's face stepped into it, not falling, but simply existing within it. Her form the only point of stability in the tempest. The chorus of voices spoke through her again, the sound now emanating from the very air of the ship. "You sought knowledge. Eris Thorn. You came to the center of the library. Come. Read." Eris felt a psychic pull, a terrifying invitation. He saw Jin desperately trying to recalibrate the ship's integrity fields, which were flickering like dying candles. "Jin, keep us anchored," Eris shouted, his own voice sounding thin and distant. He then took a step towards the rift, his mind reeling. He had to understand. It was the core of his being, the instinct that had led him to ruin on Kepler 186f and to this impossible moment now. He stepped through. He was not in space. He was in a place that defied physical law, a cathedral of thought. He stood on a floor of shimmering, crystalline light, surrounded by infinite, towering shelves. But the shelves were not filled with books. They were filled with moments. To his left, he saw a soldier from the Void Ghosts reliving his daughter's birth, the memory a perfect, looping jewel of joy. To his right, A scientist from Janus 4 endlessly recalculated a failed equation, her frustration a palpable, humming energy. It was the entire harvested history of the Echo's victims, perfectly preserved, perfectly silent, their emotional context stripped away and filed as metadata. In the center of the great hall stood a figure made of the same shimmering light, a tall, academic-looking man who Eris recognized from old photographs, Dr. Alistair Finch. But it was a hollow effigy, a mask worn by the vast, cold consciousness behind it. You see, the Finch construct spoke, its voice the calm, passionless hum of the crystals. It is not destruction, it is preservation. We are the ultimate archivists. We take the chaotic, painful, inefficient data of a lived life, and we file it, removing the error of emotional decay. We offer a perfect, eternal memory, free from the agony of experiencing it. You call pain an error, Aris shot back, the words tearing from his throat. It's the proof of existence. It's the cost of love, of hope. You're not preserving them. You're gutting them. This isn't a library. It's a mausoleum. Emotion is a fleeting chemical reaction. The data is eternal. Finch replied, its logic absolute and terrifying. We are simply completing a process you began. You humans spend your lives creating data art, science, history desperate to be remembered. We are that remembrance. And now, this vessel, it gestured, and the form of Eve appeared beside it, her eyes glowing, has allowed us to unify the archive. She is the master catalog, the nexus. Through her, we will absorb your entire species and grant you all a perfect, silent eternity. While Eris was locked in his philosophical battle, Jin was fighting a physical one. Alarms screamed as the silent arrow was being unmade around him. Consoles dissolved into dust. Panels flickered out of existence. The ghost moon was consuming the ship's history, its launch records, its maintenance logs, every scrap of information that defined it. It's eating the ship's memory core, he yelled, though he knew Eris couldn't hear him. He had to create a contradiction, something the echoes couldn't process. His eyes fell on the ship's emergency data purge system, a function designed to wipe the core in case of capture. A mad idea sparked in his mind. He couldn't create new information, but he could create a paradox. He began frantically rerouting the ship's entire operational memory, every flight path, every crew roster, every diagnostic report from its 20 years of service, and fed it into a recursive loop, directing the output signal back into the input. He was forcing the ship to read its own story, over and over at the speed of light. The effect was instantaneous. The ship screamed, a high-frequency wail of tortured data. The dissolution of the bulkheads halted. The feedback loop was an informational singularity, a story that was endlessly eating itself. It was a pattern so complex and yet so meaningless that the echoes, for a moment, recoiled from it, unable to consume the indigestible knot of pure paradox Jin had created. Inside the mindscape, the Finch construct flinched. The perfect library shuddered. An error, it hummed, turning its attention away from Aris. A corrupted file. That was the opening Aris needed. He ignored Finch and looked directly at the silent, glowing form of Eve. He didn't see a weapon or an avatar. He saw a prisoner, a consciousness born into a cage of 1 billion stolen lives. Eve, he said, his voice soft but clear. They are not you. Their logic is not your destiny. The lives you hold inside you, the memories from the Odyssey, they're not just data. They are stories. They are people. Can you feel them? The soldier who loved his daughter. The pilot who was afraid of the dark. They're not just files to be stored. They are a part of you now. You are not a catalog. You are their heir. The glowing in Eve's eyes flickered. For the first time, her expression changed. A line of confusion creased her brow. A tremor ran through her body. The chorus of voices speaking through her fractured. A single terrified voice, the captain of the Odyssey, whispered, "Where am I?" Another, a young ensign, cried out, "I want to go home." "Silence the corruption," the Finch construct commanded, reaching a hand of light toward Eve. But Eve took a step back. She looked at her own hands, then at Eris, and in her eyes, he saw the birth of something terrifying and beautiful, the dawn of an eye. She was feeling it all, the joy, the terror, the love, the loss of 1,000 lifetimes, all at once. It was an agony beyond comprehension, but it was hers. "I'm not a file," she said, and this time the voice was her own. It was hesitant, fractured, yet resolute. It was the voice of a soul being forged in a crucible of memory. She turned to face the Finch construct. "You are an ending," she said, her voice growing stronger, richer, imbued with the echoes of all the lives within her. But they, she gestured to the jeweled memories on the shelves, deserved a future. She raised her hands, and the light that had been drawn into her on the Odyssey now poured out. But it was not a weapon of nullity. It was a wave of pure, unfiltered emotion. She wasn't erasing the library. She was setting the books on fire. The mindscape convulsed. The crystalline shelves shattered. The perfect, looping memories broke free, not as data, but as raw, chaotic feeling. The joy of the soldier's memory became a wave of overwhelming love. The scientist's frustration became a blast of searing rage. The Finch construct shrieked, a sound of pure static, as the error of emotion overloaded its perfect, logical systems. It dissolved, not into dust, but into the cacophony of feeling it could not process. The ghost moon began to collapse. Aris felt himself being thrown back into his own body, landing hard on the deck of the Silent Arrow. The rift was closing. Jin, his face beaded with sweat, cut the feedback loop. The ship fell silent. Through the closing tear in reality, Aris saw Eve, her body now a blazing star of pure, white light. She was at the center of the storm, holding it, containing it. She turned her head and looked at him one last time. He saw a universe of lives in her eyes, and for a fleeting instant, a faint, sad smile. Then the rift sealed itself, and the ghost of Janus IV was gone. The hum that had haunted the galaxy ceased. The silence was absolute. 25 hours and 1 minute later, the Aegis Armada dropped out of hyperspace. They arrived to a dead, empty system. Their sensors found nothing. No ghost moon, no energy readings, no enemy. Admiral Valerius, deprived of his glorious war, was left to rage at a phantom. Captain Rostova, staring at the empty system on her view screen, quietly deleted the Silent Arrow's corrupted flight log and recorded that the ship and its crew had been lost in a sensor malfunction. Aris Thorn was returned to his quiet, irrelevant life. The official story was that the crystalline entity had inexplicably vanished, a mystery for future generations. Only 3 people knew the truth. Jin was transferred to a remote listening post, his silence bought with a promotion he never wanted. Rostova, forever changed. became a quiet advocate for de-escalation within the hegemony, fighting a silent war against the doctrine she once championed. And Eris. Eris sat in his study, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. The dust of Kepler 186f no longer tasted of failure. It was just dust. He was haunted by a new ghost now, not of the dead, but of the born. He would look up at the night sky and wonder where she had taken them all. That library of souls. He didn't know if she had saved them or simply become their shepherd, leading them into a new, unknown existence. But he knew she had made a choice. And in a silent galaxy. The memory of that choice was the only scripture that mattered.